Most people think words are harmless. Just thoughts. Just your brain treat expressions. Just emotions in the moment. But your brain doesn't treat words that way as repeated language as instruction. Every time you say, "I'm always tired. I can't do this. Nothing ever works for me," your mind listens. And over time, it begins to believe you. Because the words you repeat consistently become the story you live inside. That's why two people can experience the same situation, but respond completely differently. One says, "This is hard, but I'll figure it out." The other says, "This always happens to me." Same problem. Different language. Different emotional state. And eventually, different outcomes. Because words create meaning. And meaning creates emotion. That's why your internal language matters more than most people realize. You are constantly talking to yourself. The question is, are your words building you, or breaking you? Most of the conversations are shaping your life. Never happen out loud. They happen silently. Inside your mind. From the moment you wake up, your internal voice begins speaking. Sometimes encouraging. Sometimes destructive. And because it's always there, you stop noticing it. But your brain notices. Every word. Every label. Every repeated sentence. When you constantly tell yourself, "I'm bad at this. I always mess things up. People like me never succeed," your mind starts accepting those statements as identity. Not temporary emotions. Identity. And once something becomes identity, your behavior begins to follow it automatically. That's why negative self-talk is so dangerous. It doesn't just affect your mood. It affects your actions. Because people naturally act in alignment with who they believe they are. If you believe you're confident, you behave differently. If you believe you're incapable, you hesitate. So the words you repeat daily are not harmless. They are shaping your future behavior in real time. And the scary part? Most people are unconsciously programming themselves negatively every single day, without realizing it. Words are emotional triggers. The language you use instantly changes how you feel. Think about the difference between saying, "Backhand index pointing right, I'm exhausted," and "Backhand index pointing right, I need rest." Both describe tiredness. But emotionally, they feel completely different. One creates heaviness. The other creates awareness. That's the power of language. Words shape emotional intensity. When you constantly use extreme language like, "Backhand index pointing right, everything is ruined." "Backhand index pointing right, nothing works." "Backhand index pointing right, I'm failing at life." Your brain reacts emotionally as if those statements are true. Stress increases. Motivation drops. Confidence weakens. And over time, that emotional state becomes your normal. But here's the powerful part. Backhand index pointing right, the opposite is also true. The right language can calm your mind, strengthen your focus, and shift your emotional state instantly. That's why emotionally intelligent people pay attention to the words they use. Not because they're pretending everything is perfect, but because they understand. Language creates emotional direction. And emotional direction influences behavior. There's a major difference between how powerless people speak and how empowered people speak. Victim language sounds like this: "I have no choice. Life is unfair. Nothing ever changes." This type of language removes responsibility. It gives away power. And when people speak this way long enough, they begin to feel helpless. But leaders speak differently. Even in difficult situations. Instead of saying, "I can't," they ask, "How can I?" Instead of saying, "This ruined me," they ask, "What can this teach me?" That shift may seem small. But psychologically, it changes everything. Because empowering language creates possibility. And possibility creates action. The words you choose determine whether your mind sees walls or solutions. One of the most dangerous things you can do is labeling yourself negatively. I'm lazy. I'm awkward. I'm not disciplined. Because repeated labels become mental identity. And once your brain accepts a label, it starts defending it. That's why people struggle to change. Not because change is impossible, but because their identity resists it. Your mind always wants consistency between your beliefs and your behavior. So if you label yourself as lazy, your brain unconsciously pushes you toward actions that confirm it. That's why you must separate behavior from identity. Instead of saying, "I'm lazy," say, "I've developed lazy habits." One attacks identity. The other describes behavior. And behavior can change. The way you speak to yourself matters more than most people realize. Because your brain is always listening. And every repeated phrase becomes emotional conditioning. That's why changing your life often begins with changing your language. Not fake positivity. Not pretending everything is perfect. But learning to speak in a way that creates strength instead of weakness. Most people use language that intensifies problems. They say, "I'm terrible at this. My life is a mess. I'll never change." And every time they repeat those words, their emotional state gets heavier. Their confidence drops. Their energy weakens. But powerful people learn how to reframe. Instead of saying, "This is impossible," they say, "This is difficult, but I can learn it." Instead of, "I failed," they say, "This is difficult, but I can learn it." Instead of, "I failed," they say, "I'm improving through experience." The situation may be the same, but the emotional meaning changes completely. And meaning shapes behavior. That's why reframing is powerful. It doesn't deny reality. It changes your relationship with reality. And when your emotional relationship changes, your actions change too. You become calmer, more focused, more resilient. Because your words are no longer working against you. They're working for you. Your internal voice is important. But it's not the only voice shaping your life. Backhand index pointing right, your environment speaks too. The people around you. The content you consume. The conversations you hear daily. All of it influences your thinking. Because the human mind absorbs language constantly. If you spend enough time around negativity, eventually, it becomes normal. You begin hearing phrases like, "Backhand index pointing right, nothing works anymore." Backhand index pointing right, success is impossible. Backhand index pointing right, people never change. And without realizing it, you start repeating those same patterns internally. That's why environment matters so much. Because language is contagious. Energy is contagious. Mindsets are contagious. The people around you either reinforce growth or reinforce limitation. That doesn't mean you must avoid everyone who struggles. But it does mean you must protect your mind carefully. Because repeated exposure shapes belief. And belief shapes identity. This is also why social media affects people so deeply. If you constantly consume fear, anger, negativity, and comparison, your internal dialogue slowly changes. Your confidence weakens. Your thinking becomes heavier. But when you surround yourself with empowering language, your mind begins to expand. You think differently. You expect more from yourself. And gradually, your identity begins to shift. Because your environment is always programming you. The question is, what kind of programming are you receiving every day? The human mind learns through repetition. Not once. Not twice. Repeated exposure. That's how beliefs are formed. If you hear something enough times, your brain begins accepting it as truth. Even if it isn't true. That's why negative self-talk becomes dangerous over time. At first, it feels small. I'm not good enough. I always mess things up. But when those words are repeated daily, your mind starts building identity around them. And eventually, you stop questioning them. They become automatic. That's why repetition is powerful. It programs the subconscious mind. But here's the good news. The same principle works in your favor. Just as negative repetition creates limitation, positive repetition can create transformation. Not empty affirmations. Not unrealistic fantasies. But intentional, empowering language repeated consistently. For example, I'm improving every day. I can learn this. I'm becoming more disciplined. At first, it may feel unfamiliar. Maybe. Because your mind is used to the old story. But over time, the new language begins to feel more natural. Then believable. Then real. And eventually, it becomes an identity. That's how transformation happens. Quietly. Repeatedly. One thought at a time. Most people live with an internal voice that constantly criticizes them. A voice that says, "You're behind. You're not enough. You'll probably fail." And because that voice has been there for so long, they think it's normal. But imagine what happens when that voice changes. Imagine waking up and hearing, "Keep going. You're growing. You can handle this." That shift changes everything. Because your internal voice influences your emotional state every day. It affects how you handle stress. How you respond to failure. How quickly you recover from setbacks. That's why building a stronger internal voice is one of the most important things you can do. But it doesn't happen overnight. It happens through awareness. You begin catching negative language in real time. You notice when your mind starts attacking you. And instead of automatically believing it, you challenge it. Then gradually, you replace it. Not with perfection, but with strength. With truth. With growth-oriented thinking. Over time, your internal voice becomes less destructive. And more supportive. Not weak. Not fake. Backhand index pointing right strong. And eventually, that new voice becomes your default mindset. At the end of the day, the words you repeat daily are shaping your reality. Not instantly, but gradually, quietly, consistently. Because language influences emotion. Emotion influences behavior. And behavior shapes your future. That's why your words matter more than you think. Every time you say, "Backhand index pointing right, I can't," your brain reacts. Every time you say, "Backhand index pointing right, I'll figure it out," your brain reacts differently. That small shift may not seem important in the moment. But repeated over weeks, months, and years. Backhand index pointing right, it changes who you become. Because identity is built through repetition. The story you tell yourself repeatedly eventually feels real. So if you want a different life, start by changing the story. Not with fake confidence. Not with denial. But with intentional language that creates strength instead of weakness. Speak to yourself in ways that move you forward. Speak in ways that create possibility. Speak in ways that support growth. Because your mind is always listening. And the words you repeat most become the instructions your brain follows. So here's the question. What have you been repeatedly saying to yourself that's keeping you stuck? And what would happen if you changed that language starting today? Because the moment your internal voice changes, your life begins changing with it. At the end of the day, your mind is always listening. Every word you repeat, every label you accept, every sentence you say about yourself, is shaping the person you become. That's why your self-talk matters. Because your internal voice can either build your confidence, or slowly destroy it. And most people never realize they've been speaking against themselves for years. Starting today, pay attention to your language for the next 24 hours. Notice every time you say, I can't, I'm not good enough, nothing works, I always fail. And instead of accepting those words automatically, pause. Then replace them with something stronger. Not fake positivity. Intentional language. Instead of, I can't do this, say, I'm learning how to do this. Instead of, I always fail, say, I'm improving through experience. That small shift may seem simple, but repeated consistently, it changes your mindset. And eventually, it changes your identity. If you want to understand how your mind works, break the mental patterns holding you back, and become stronger mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, then this channel is for you. Because here, we don't just give motivation. We help you reprogram the way you think. So subscribe now. And join a growing community of people committed to transforming their mindset and taking control of their lives. Change your words, and you begin changing your reality. I'll see you in the next episode.